Hello and welcome to the interview here on France 24. 20 years ago, in July 1995, some 8,000 Muslim men were killed in the hands of Serbian forces in the Bosnian town of Srebrenica. This has often been described as the worst massacre on European soil since World War II and as a genocide by international courts of justice. Since then, the failure of the international community to protect the town, which was under the protection of both the United Nations and NATO, has been a deeply controversial issue. And as the world commemorates the 20th anniversary of the somber episode, new explosive claims have emerged whereby the United States, Great Britain, and France secretly agreed not to fully defend the enclave just as it was about to fall. We are joined today by the man who was the Bosnia's foreign minister at the time, Mohamed Shakerbey. He joins us via satellite from New York. Mr. Shakerbey, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Mr. Perlman.
So, just a couple of days ago, the leader of the Bosnian Serb entity, Milorad Dodik, declared that calling what happened in Srebrenica genocide is, I quote him, a lie. What's your answer?
It's not important what he thinks. It's important that he actually rules over that town to this day. As you said, the International Court of Justice and the Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia have both ruled that it was genocide and that it was an obligation of Belgrade, but also Dodik's government, to recognize this genocide as part of the settlement, as part of the judgment. They have failed to do so, but worse, they continue to perpetrate the genocide in other forms, by in effect completing the ethnic cleansing.
So it seems that 20 years later, the wound is still open, the war is over, but clearly there are still issues with the way this is being seen. If you're in Belgrade or in actually Sarajevo.
Yes, but it's not so much about an old wound. It's really that there is a new wound constantly being made, because the inhabitants of Srebrenica, those people who suffered the most, still have had no satisfaction. There has been, in fact, no remedy, no recourse for them for the terrible crime that was done. And even when they go back to Srebrenica now, they continue to face persecution and discrimination, as, of course, Mr. Dodik's statement would indicate.
I want to get back to some of the things I mentioned in the introduction, especially what Western powers knew at the time. There has been suspicion for many years, maybe 20 years actually, that the West knew much more about what was to happen, and especially did not do its utmost to prevent what happened. Now there are fresh allegations that the three major powers at the time in Bosnia, France, the United States, and Great Britain, agreed that they would not do their utmost to defend Srebrenica, and did not tell some of their closest allies, especially the Netherlands, which had boots on the ground in the face of UN peacekeepers.
Well, as you know, Mark, I've been saying this for almost 20 years. It turned out to be an allegation when I started suspecting that, in fact, Srebrenica was betrayed. What is, I think, worse right now is that there's clear evidence, not only that the UK, the US, and France made an agreement that they would not provide NATO air support as required, as mandated both by UN and NATO resolutions, but they did not let, that is, the Sarajevo government know, so it could take any sort of measures to save that population, and they did not let the Dutch know, who were responsible for the peacekeeping mandate. More importantly, they actually seem to have let Belgrade know, and Mladic and Milosevic's forces, that in fact they did have a green light to go into Srebrenica. Now, I used to use the word yellow light and green light to describe those events because the evidence was not complete as it is now. I think it's more accurate now to use the words acquiescence or even complicity. Even if we use the word reckless, that has legal consequences. And I must emphasize there have been no consequences for those responsible, but also no consequences, no remedy for Bosnia and Herzegovina, and particularly the people who suffered the most in Srebrenica.
So I want to go back to this latest batch of allegations that are coming out from a Dutch TV documentary, and basically are saying the enclave fell in early July, but as early as late May, there was apparently a phone call between President Bill Clinton, British Prime Minister John Major, and the new French President Jacques Chirac, whereby they agreed that there would be no airstrikes against the Serbs, and also from US documents that they would not tell this publicly. I mean, for you, how serious is that in terms of news?
I feel betrayed as an American, but also, of course, as someone who represented Bosnia and Herzegovina at the time. Worst of all, I would emphasize they did, in fact, signal Mladic's and Milosevic's forces that there would be no response. So not only could we not take precautions, the Dutch could not take precautions, but in fact, as I said, the green light was given to Belgrade and to Banja Luka. And this is, as I said, complicity. At least it's acquiescence. Now, the reason for that was to try to draw Milosevic into the talks that ended up with Dayton, and that actually ended up with Srebrenica as part of the Serb-held territory. But the idea of somehow sacrificing Srebrenica in order to get an agreement from Milosevic seems to be beyond the bounds not only of legality, but even diplomacy.
But one could argue that at the time there were also some UN peacekeepers taken hostages, including French and British UN peacekeepers, and that this might have been a way to negotiate that, and that the Western powers could not imagine what would happen to the inhabitants, especially the male inhabitants of Srebrenica.
Yes, one could argue, but frankly not very credibly. Mladic had left a trail of blood. Every other town he had conquered, his paramilitary forces had taken, men, women, children were slaughtered. So he had a track record, and he's on trial at the International Criminal Tribunal right now for that track record, not only in Srebrenica, but before then. Second of all, we know that a few months only after that, when NATO airstrikes did start, and seriously threatened Mladic because of a subsequent massacre attack on Sarajevo, that in fact no UN forces, no UN peacekeepers were hurt at all. And this is what brought the conflict to an end. So this was an effort really only to satisfy Milosevic and Mladic in terms of their territorial demands. And what they wanted was territories in the eastern part of Bosnia that would in effect allow them to secede by being more or less a clean cut without these three enclaves. That's why they wanted those territories, and unfortunately, I suspect, and I think it will be shown, that is why Washington, London, and Paris, in effect, left Srebrenica, and I also must mention Žepa, another enclave, defenseless.
Also coming now is some declarations by the then Dutch defense minister. First of all, that he did not know about that secret decision that might explain why airstrikes that were called by the UN peacekeepers on the ground in Srebrenica were not responded to, but also that Western intelligence services perfectly knew what the Serbs were going to do in Srebrenica, that not only did they stop airstrikes, but they knew precisely what would happen to the inhabitants. Do you share that assessment?
Absolutely, and I was in very close contact both with the Dutch defense minister and the foreign minister of the time. They not only did not know, but they were being fed false information in order to somehow pacify them and cause them not to act. They did actually act, and at least on 5, maybe 6 occasions, they demanded airstrikes, including in one specific situation where they called me and said, "We have asked NATO for airstrikes, we expect it to start tomorrow." Everyone on the ground, including the Dutch peacekeepers on the ground, expected it to happen, and it did not. And of course, the one person at least that knew would not was Mladic. And that's why he just pranced into Srebrenica. And if you look at films of him from that period, he's not only acting with impunity, but he's acting as if someone who has no fear of the consequences at that moment from NATO.
So, in a nutshell, you believe that the Western powers cynically sacrificed Srebrenica and its inhabitants in pursuit of a peace deal that was signed a couple of months later in Dayton.
That's correct. And I signed Dayton, and I can tell you that the message we were given in Dayton, in effect, it seemed like a plan that lasted not only for a few days, but several months. We were told in Dayton, unless we agreed that Srebrenica and Žepa would be part of the Serb-held territory, the talks would fall apart and we would be held responsible for the failure of peace. So what I really am most resentful of, there was never even afterwards an admission of a mistake, of people saying maybe we shouldn't have allowed this to happen. Rather, they went ahead with the plan that they had arranged with Milosevic to give him these territories as part of any agreement. And even today, there has been no relief for the victims of Srebrenica. Srebrenica continues to be under the hold of Dodik, the same person that now says there was no genocide in Srebrenica.
Just very last question, very quickly. Do you imagine doing something about it, maybe from a legal standpoint?
Yes, and the legal representative, the attorney for the soldiers, the Dutch soldiers, Dutchbat, who was in Srebrenica, has asked me to join them in asking for full disclosure of what occurred, because there are still certain documents, critical days that are completely blacked out. But beyond that, this is not about getting some sort of satisfaction like revenge. This is really about remedies. Remedies for Bosnia and Herzegovina, and remedies in particular for those inhabitants of Srebrenica. I think it's also about the future of the rule of law. If you want Bosnia and Herzegovina to be part of the Euro-Atlantic family, then you must expect it to act under the rule of law and respect it with the rule of law.
Okay, thank you very much, Mohammed Shakir Bey, joining us from New York to talk about what happened in Srebrenica 20 years ago. Thank you for watching this edition of The Interview here on France 24.